Hey everybody, welcome back to the CGSP Roundtable. Today I'm joined by my good friend Geraud from Mauritius. Geraud, if you guys aren't familiar, is our incredible Africa editor who also oversees all of our Francophone site and our French language service. Geraud, really good afternoon to you. Great to be back on the Roundtable. First time for me this year, actually, so it's exciting.
Yes, I was about to say it's us, it's me who should welcome you back since you've been missing in action those last few weeks. So yeah, it's really good to be back. Yeah,
I was in California for a few weeks, and the time zones. I mean, the time zones from California to Mauritius and to Asia were just brutal. So, so happy to finally be back in Vietnam.
Definitely good.
Yeah, we have a fantastic show for everybody today. I mean, it's really just so exciting because we got a lot of good topics for you guys. Okay, first, we're going to talk about the China-Africa trade figures that came in back in January. We've started to kind of sift through these numbers. Geraud is going to give us a breakdown of what it means, and we'll have a chat about what do the trade numbers tell us about the state of the China-Africa relationship in 2023. And that's a very important discussion to have, because this is a year of FOCAC. That's the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. That will be a summit that takes place every 3 years, or a ministerial gathering. We're not sure if it's going to be a summit or a ministerial gathering. It will take place later this year, but they are in the negotiations right now trying to figure out what the agenda is going to be. These trade numbers might give us some insight on where that is going. We also got some fantastic data about the Belt and Road Initiative, which we're going to share with you, some of the updates there. And finally, we're going to talk about our favorite subject. This is what Geraud and I geek out on every single day: mining logistics in Southern Africa. Doesn't sound that exciting, but it's really exciting. And this is where the great power competition is actually playing out between the US and China in Africa more than anywhere else. Okay, so let's get started with these China-Africa trade figures. So Geraud, one of the things I said we've been looking at is the question of all of the data. So, and the data for us has been something that we really look at, quite closely. It comes out in the beginning of the year. Let's kind of take a look at some of the figures. This is what it looks like. This is from the General Administration of Customs. Basically, what they do is they list every country, every region, and they started in Africa kind of is broken down by country. You took this data and then you kind of looked at it and said, okay, let's see what it looks like. What did the data tell you? Tell us about this graphic, and give us the headlines of what China-Africa trade looked like in 2023.
So in 2023, China-Africa trade numbers are quite interesting. What we've noticed, it's I say overall stagnant numbers, because we are only increasing to 1.5% comparing to 2022. So we are 282 billion something. There are so many numbers after the comma. We're gonna get into the details. We're gonna give the details in the show notes. But yes, we are $282 billion. So we also have in China-Africa trade numbers, we have a decrease of importation, China importation, from 117 billion in 2022 to 109 billion in 2023. We have an increase of exports from China to Africa from 162 to 174. So what comes to consequences that the trade deficit between Africa and China kind of increased a lot, from 49 billion in 2022 to 64 billion in 2023.
That's a lot of numbers. Hold on, let's take a pause right there. Okay, so what you're basically saying, and just so I understand this, is that the Chinese sold about $60 billion more to Africa than Africa sold to China. Okay.
Exactly, yeah.
That's a little bit of a surprise in some respects, because typically Africans are selling a lot of commodities, high value oil, minerals, and things like that. So you would expect those numbers to be more equal. In the past, they have been more equal. But now it looks like there's more demand from the African side for Chinese goods than Chinese demand for African goods. Is that right?
No, it's been quite interesting in 2023 in a way that China imported less from Africa that it did in the previous years, but still quite high. But one thing also to keep in mind that in general, China-Africa trade balance are always in balance toward China. China has a positive commercial trade balance toward Africa. Only, and this is really a very interesting fact. Only for few countries, there's only three countries in Africa where China has a trade deficit, and those three are the top three among the top five. You have South Africa, Angola, and DRC, and they have a positive trade balance to China because they are commodities exported to China. So yes, those are the quite interesting numbers, and we're gonna even go to our pictures there to kind of and see what the top five African trade China trade partners in 2023. We have South Africa, we have South Africa, we have Angola, we have the DRC, we have Egypt, and we have Ghana. Those are China main top five trade partners in 2023. So it's really interesting to see how all of them are kind of interacting with China in different ways. What interesting fact also to keep in mind that one characteristic, I think we're gonna talk about that. One main characteristic is like natural resources, raw materials are dominating the China-Africa trade, and it's mainly because of natural resources that countries like the DRC, Angola, and South Africa are kind of enjoying a positive trade balance toward China compared to the others in the rest of Africa. All of them, except those top three, all of them, they have a negative trade balance with China.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't get graphic back again. StreamYard isn't cooperating with me. But again, what you talked about is this highly distorted relationship on trade. And when you hear the Chinese talk about China-Africa trade, they are talking about Africa almost as if it's a country, not a continent. So they oftentimes, you'll see the headlines coming out of Chinese media saying China-Africa trade reached new heights. Again, it's a little bit odd when we're talking about a country and a continent. And so that is very unusual. We almost don't really talk about countries and continents because it's not really a fair comparison here. But what we can see, there's the graphic, finally caught up with me. What we see is that it's resource exporting countries that are selling to China. So it's a highly extractive relationship. It's still oil, minerals. That is the traditional pattern of African trade with the world that dates back 400 or 500 years. There's nothing really that different about what the Chinese are doing today and what the Portuguese and the British and others have done previously. Is that correct? Is that a fair statement?
Exactly. It's a quite fair statement. It's a quite fair statement. We cannot deny that.
I mean, they don't like to be in the same comparison as the colonialists, but what's happening is raw materials are leaving Africa and they're buying back finished products. And that's been the dynamic for a long time.
Yes, and the interesting part about those raw materials, and I'm going to talk for countries like a country like the DRC, because DRC is exporting a lot of copper and cobalt to China. So when it comes to copper, since the DRC is already refining copper to 99%, DRC is exporting to China a pure copper metal, so basically straight to the industry. On the cobalt side, it needs processing. From Angola, it's raw. It's raw petrol they have to send to China to be refined and everything. But South Africa, it's the only one that's kind of has a very diversified balanced profile with China. You know, they benefit, like they send manufactured goods, they send wine, they send all kinds of product, and they also export raw material, raw ones and processed ones. So basically, in all this China-Africa trade, the only country that's really winning in Africa, it's South Africa. You know, and positive trade balance and very diversified trade profile with China.
Well, South Africa also has a rather robust manufacturing sector. So the Chinese are building cars. They're assembling electronics. Hisense has factories there. So it's the most diversified economy. So in many respects, what you're saying is that it's an example of what the future of China-Africa trade could
Should
look
look
like.
like. Should look like. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so on the exporting side out, we have the old story of basically the raw material, the commodity exporters, the big powerhouse,
Exactly.
Angola,
Exactly.
DRC, Zambia to some extent, and again, we're looking
Egypt,
at cobalt,
Ghana.
copper,
Yeah.
oil, things like that.
Yeah.
Then on the import side, again, a very predictable story here that it's the big countries, Nigeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, South Africa, and Kenya, that really round out the top 5 in terms of imports.
Yeah.
And so we have a story, again, when we talk about this China-Africa trade relationship, it's, again, 60-70% of that is concentrated in just 4 or 5 countries on both sides, import and export. So the rest of Africa does not really have a very robust trade relationship with China.
Let me give you just give you another number. Those top 5 African countries in total, in terms of export and import in total of China, Africa, they all represent roughly 45.3% of all trade China, Africa. Only those 5. South Africa, Angola, DRC, Ghana, and Egypt. They represent a total of 44%, roughly 44% of China-Africa trade. That just tells you how much the remaining one, except Eswatini, who doesn't have a relationship with China. The remaining one, all of them, they're just like 56%. And that just tells you, when you look at the number, when you dig into certain numbers, it's really fascinating to realize that certain countries just basically they have no exports relationship with China. They import most of them. They import most of things from China. In terms of exporting, nothing. And this is where I like to mention something that you remember in 2022, China has granted a zero policy and is free. I'm not a free trade, but has lowered down. As zero tariff for 6 to 10 countries in terms of the export to China, so allowing them to access much more market in China. So when you look at those numbers, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Sao Tome and Principe, and all of the different countries, when you look how they behave in 2023, nothing changed. Nothing changed. So those policies did not have any effect on how they could trade with China, and it's quite sad. And I understand why Uganda president was complaining with the Chinese vice prime minister by saying we need much more access to Chinese market. We need not only natural resources, but we need to have much more access to China market for different products coming from Africa.
And that's probably going to be one of the big themes at FOCAC this year, is more market access. And again, that's not a simple thing. So Yoweri Museveni said that a couple weeks ago at the Non-Aligned Movement, that's the G77 plus China summit that took place in Kampala. And this is, by the way, something that Museveni has been saying for a couple of years. The problem is that in order to get products on the list that can be imported into China, they have to go through a lot of processing in terms of determining the quality of it, determining the safety of the agriculture. So there's quite a few steps. It's not simply just lift up the gate and let everything in, because they have to actually approve each product that comes in. And so it's a rather complicated process.
But they also have to have those products to export to China. The reality is most of those countries are poor countries with very, very poor industrial landscape. They just have nothing to export to China. Let's face it. When they talk about it, when you look at other countries, you see, yes, a lot of agricultural products, cocoa from Ghana and being exported to China, and cocoa from Cote d'Ivoire and everything. But except that, you don't have manufacture like finished chocolate coming from Ghana or coming from Cote d'Ivoire to China. You don't have that because they don't process cocoa and they don't produce chocolate there as well.
And you have another problem on agricultural exports, which is what a lot of people are talking about, is that Africa as a continent is a continent right now that cannot feed itself. It has to import food. It's a net food importer. And so there is a moral question. There is a does it make sense question to be exporting large quantities of food from Africa to China, if that's something that was even to be done. The bigger problem, though, is let's say that's something that they want to do. The fact is that the African agricultural system across the continent is really not set up for mass agriculture, except in a couple of countries like South Africa.
Yeah.
And so you have a lot of smallholder farms that are not really well situated to feed a country like China. That's why the Chinese prefer to buy food from Brazil, the United States, Russia, Ukraine, when Ukraine was exporting, the European Union. These are massive, massive agricultural, industrial scale exporters. Even here in Southeast Asia as well, they buy a lot of food. And so
Exactly.
I'm not really sure agriculture is the future of China-Africa trade. And to
Even
your point,
yeah.
Geraud, just one quick thing is that we have these trade imbalances that you talked about, big deficits that now they're coming. So
Yeah.
African countries are importing a lot from China, but not exporting a lot back.
Yeah.
Agriculture is not going to be the thing that closes that trade deficit. So I don't know what Museveni has in mind for what he wants to sell to Chinese to close deficits that are in the billions. So you look at a country like Kenya, they imported something, and again, I don't have the exact numbers, something around $3.7, $3.8 billion worth of goods and sold back something like $200 or $300 million worth of goods. How can Kenya close that divide? That's something that I still don't have an answer for.
Yes, that's quite a huge gap to fill. And you even mentioned that in the column that you wrote about those figures. Like China made a commitment, since we spoke about FOCAC. China made a commitment in 2021 in the last FOCAC that, you know, in the last 3 years we are going to increase our imports from Africa to 300 billion. We are way, way far from that 300 billion. So unless something exceptional happen between now until FOCAC, we are likely to have that discussion again during the next FOCAC, and we are likely to have that topic raised by many African countries. But the reality is, how do you fill that gap without natural resources? Since many African countries, they really don't have any manufactured product or goods to export to China. And plus, as you mentioned about agriculture, so if we ever start to produce that high level of the high numbers of agricultural product, we need it more than to export it to China. We need it more for us than exporting to China. So yeah, we have so many things we're gonna have to deal with in the future just to make sure that we are good on that side.
Okay, so here are the numbers. You can look at all of them yourself. We'll put a link to this on the show notes so that you can see. It's fascinating, and they really have a lot of data here. You can see country by country what the imports are, what the exports are. It's really interesting, and then you can come to your own conclusions as to whether or not you think that what Geraud and I have said makes sense, or if you think there's something different there. So it's, you know, I mean, the data is all there. I really love the fact that the Chinese produce this data every year. It's
really amazing.
So they go, you know, again, country by country, region by region. So you have North America there, and you have, you know, the Caribbean, you have the Solomon Islands. I mean, down to these tiny little islands. So you can see what China's total trade relationship. By the way, just some context to what Geraud was saying at the beginning. So that 1.5% increase that the Chinese had in the year is actually quite good when you look at the fact that total global trade by the Chinese fell by 5%. So Africa was one of the few positive, in the green, in the black indicators for China. The rest of the regions, including ASEAN here in Southeast Asia, went down. So that is something that should be taken into account. Let's now change directions to the Belt and Road. And this is a new report that came out from the Green Finance and Development Center. Also, Griffith University in Australia put this together. This is really the definitive report that comes out every year on the health of the Belt and Road here. Let me go ahead and walk through some of the findings from this report, Geraud, and then we can get your take on it. So this is, again, a little bit of a surprise here that overall spending on the Belt and Road with BRI countries went up last year. And that is something that's new, because all we've been hearing about now for the past 3, 4, 5 years is that the BRI is curtailing, they're reining it in, they're not spending as much. So that was actually quite interesting. And you see the investment is what's going up. So they're spending a lot less on construction, and they're spending more on investment. That's a trend that we saw last year started to take place, where the Chinese now are pulling back from the policy banks, that's the lending, and wanting the private enterprises, the state-owned enterprises, to take more of this. So you're starting to see a lot more investment in telecommunications, in mining. So this is a lot of this investment, I imagine, is also in the mining sectors. And these are these key industries that the Chinese are focusing on in the Belt and Road. No more are they doing the big infrastructure projects all over the world. They still are doing some, and we're going to talk about that later. But for the most part, they're backing away from it. But let's talk a little bit about lending. Lending is something that's picked up a little bit as well. So we thought that the loans and the debt issues got in the way and that they're pulling back. But it turns out last year, lending kind of crept up. So you see it's been largely flat for, since 18 or 19, and then started kind of edging up from 22 again. Let's take a look at some of the different regions where we're seeing this activity take place. Latin America, interestingly, was one of the laggards, even though there was some increase in FDI spending. We did a fantastic podcast on that with Margaret Myers. And if you haven't heard that show, I'd recommend you check it out, also right here on YouTube. But you can see there, Geraud, Africa doing pretty well relative to some of the other regions.
Oh,
and
yeah.
That is, again, something that's also quite revealing. Okay, let's get your take now, Geraud. BRI 2023. What surprised you about this data?
Let me add another element in for the data, for the people to kind of get us and to understand, and it's really complex. And I'm gonna just read this in the same reports as for those who are following us. We're gonna put the notes still in the show notes. You're gonna be able to download the report and see that for yourself. It's very interesting. When you look at the largest investor in the BRI in 2023, it's quite interesting. You have China KTL, Contemporex, Ampex Technology, you have Zijin Mining, you have Southern Power Grid, you have Zhejiang Huayo Cobalt, you have China Molybdenum, you have Mine Metals, you have Alibaba, you have China Construction. You have a lot of natural resources companies on the top 5. Zijin, Contemporex, Zhejiang Huayo, and China Molybdenum. So when you look at the construction company, of course, you have Power Construction, you have China Petroleum and Chemical, and all of that just shows you, like, it's very interesting how they kind of put in that BRI space all the big mining companies where really they drive Chinese BRI investment in not only in Africa, but in the rest of the world. And that explains to you why when China goes to Africa, they always now that they always puts everything and shape everything big in Chinese investment into the BRI, mining, construction, and everything. It's very, very much interesting. And something also interesting that I wanted to point it out in that BRI is the fact that, and we've seen that in many countries, China is going, it's remaining, it's coming back into the construction building business in many African countries, in many BRI countries. But in Africa, it's also interesting to see how you see the rise of public-private partnership. That becomes the way to go for many Chinese companies to keep on investing in infrastructure and to make sure that despite the fact that, we are moving away from big infrastructure, but we still remain there through public-private partnership to mitigate the risk, to make sure that we don't find ourselves in a very delicate situation with debt issues in those African countries, and to make sure that we get the concession contract after that to guarantee that we're gonna get our money back. So China is even also changing its approach into investing in those big projects in Africa. It's pulled away from lending billions just to let you build, to now, okay, I'm getting now into the business. We are also sharing the burden and we're taking the risk together, and we're going to see how we're going to make money out of it.
I mean, the fact is that most African countries today simply don't have the capacity to take on new loans. Many of the major countries are just struggling, and actually struggling may not be the fair word. Actually, one of the things that I've noticed, and just do a little tangent here on some of the debt management, is how Nigeria and Kenya and some of the other countries are actually doing quite a good job at pushing down their debt levels and repaying, staying on the good side of the credit agencies. We ran a story this week about Zambia's finance minister, for the first time, expressed some optimism that he thinks a deal can finally be done within the next 6 months to resolve the dispute between Chinese creditors and the bondholders. So there is some progress being made on the debt side. The one thing, to your point, Geraud, Zambia, Kenya, Nigeria, pick your country. Ethiopia, certainly, given the fact that they defaulted on part of their debt, cannot take hundreds and billions of dollars of new loans for infrastructure right now. That may be, there may be a time for that, but they can't do it right now. So that's going to be interesting. And so what we're going to see now is more creative financing. That is more public-private partnerships, more, maybe a bigger pool of investors who are coming in. So it's not just the Chinese, but maybe the Chinese bring in the Emiratis, they bring in the Saudis, they bring in others to share in some of the risk. And then maybe there's going to be more demand for the African side and for the Congolese and Kenyan side to do more risk, to take a greater share of that risk as well. So, but I think the key takeaway for me is that the Belt and Road is still a thing.
Definitely.
And you see too much discussion in the global West about how the Belt and Road is done, the road to nowhere. This is not, it's kind of full of debt traps and things like that. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is that this thing is evolving. And it's evolving quite quickly. And what it looks like today is very different than what it looked like even just a few years ago. Again, this report is absolutely critical to understand what it is. Christopher Nedapal-Wong, he's the guy who puts it together. He's fantastic. He's probably the best in the business at doing this. He and his team at the Green Finance and Development Center and Griffiths University in Asia, and Fudan University, they kind of work on this together. You got to read this if you want to understand what's going on. This is the kind of thing, Geraud, that we keep saying that when we have interactions with different stakeholders from global South governments, particularly in Africa, these are the kinds of things that they should be picking up and reading very closely to understand where the trends are.
Definitely. You cannot be in a leadership position in Africa, following China Africa, and not being interested, not having an alert ring bell on your computer when those kind of reports come out. You have to have that. You have to be reading them. You have to be understanding them. Since we don't produce our own research, since we don't do our own research on the ground to make sure to get our own trend, at least you have to get right those numbers to kind of understand where China is moving, what the big players, what are changing, what are the new trends and everything, to allow us to how to adapt and how to align our own interests with Chinese interests in Africa to see how we can make it really a win-win. Otherwise, you're just going to have the win-win rhetoric from China perspective without really winning on our side. And
if you're not using this data, then you are far more susceptible to some of the media narratives that are misleading or inaccurate. And I think so this data is what allows you to actually have that understanding of what's going on. Okay.
Let me go back a bit just to add up on that. Since you mentioned data, and since this show has been it's been a lot about data. We in the first topic we talked about trade numbers. We gave data. In this one, we tell you another number. Other data is about BRI, and I'm gonna insist, really, people, you really have to get your data right when you talk about China. The data out there. Before you jumping on conclusion based on what you receive from different media, being Chinese or being Western, just take the data, open them up, and do the analysis yourself to understand, like, oh no, they're exaggerating here, they're lying here, they're conflating this issue here. That's not the case. It's very much important. China-Africa relations, since it's a lot economics, it's a lot in financing, infrastructure, data matters. You really have to get your data right to understand that.
The problem is that it takes a lot of time and effort to go through all these data reports, and you have to have some context to understand it. I mean, William Ruto, the president of Kenya, was saying a couple of weeks ago that he really wants to set up a more robust China desk in the Kenyan foreign ministry. And you would think that that's the kind of place that would actually sit and go through this data in order to provide the president with some guidance and advice. And you hope that more governments do a better job at doing this. And by the way, just as an American, I don't want people to think like, well, you know, why are you picking on the Kenyans for doing this? When in fact,
even Americans,
we've heard Anthony Blinken, who was just in Africa, spewing out all sorts of bad information. And what's so tragic about all of this is the fact that nowhere else does more incredible China knowledge production than in the United States, particularly in Washington. There are amazing universities and think tanks and research institutes that are producing amazing data, and yet they're still spewing out crappy information at the top.
Senators, House of Representatives, different commission.
Exactly.
Guys, so you just have to cross the streets, cross the street.
Exactly.
Go get the data.
It's all there. It's all there. And so this is not a problem unique to Kenya or the Congo.
Exactly.
This is also a problem in Europe and also in the United States as well. So that kind of data. Okay, let's move very quickly now to, speaking of big infrastructure projects. So people are going to think, Geraud, like, wait, you guys are speaking out of both sides of your mouth. All you guys have been talking about over the past 6 months to a year is smart is beautiful, small is beautiful. The big infrastructure projects are no longer happening anymore in Africa. That's what you guys have been saying. Then this week we hear that the Chinese came out with $1 billion plan to revamp the Tazara Railway. So this was news that broke this week, that they submitted a $1 billion proposal. Here's what we don't know, okay? We don't know the details of this proposal. We don't know how much is coming from policy banks, how much is in the form of debt, how much is in the form of a public-private partnership. Are there other investors? So we don't know anything more than what Bloomberg told us, and that Ambassador Du in Lusaka handed over a plan to the Ministry of Transportation and said, this is what we think needs to be done to refurbish the 50-year-old Tazara Railway. Okay. So let's get into kind of what is the Tazara Railway, and so why is this so important? And I just want I want you to explain to us a little bit about the history. So this railway you see on the right here that goes from Zambia to the port of Dar es Salaam, and again, there's a lot of history in this railway. So why don't you give us a little bit of the background before we get into the geopolitics and the debt issues?
So the Tazara Railway, it was a railway built by China, I think in 1973, connecting Zambia, Tanzania.
In 75.
In 1975, yes, connecting Zambia in the copper belt to Tanzania, to the port of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. So it's a long railway. It was at that time, it was a grant that China helped, donation that China has done to those countries. So 49 years down the line, the question became how to refurbish the railway, how to, to modernize it and everything. Though those two countries have been talking and discussing with China for a long, long time. That project was Zambia and Tanzania always wanted to go with China in that project. So the number that came before, very early, when it was John Magufuli, it was around 3 billion. John Magufuli was really tough on China, saying, no way, we're moving forward with that. John Magufuli passed, and Samia Suluhu took power in Tanzania, and the discussion resumed back. And they say, okay, we're going to find a way to make it work. So what China wanted, since you talked about the 1 billion, how China is moving away, the difference here is like we have two elements of context we have to put into this topic. First one is the approach that China is using. It's not a loan, it's going to be a private-public partnership. They gave quite the detail in terms of how we're going to approach that. It's going to be a commercial project, not like we are just giving you and we're leaving you with that. No, it's going to be a project where China always also got the concession contract, because the other side, in Lobito's side, what China has done, China refurbished the Benguela Railway from Angola to Lobito to Lao and the port of the DRC, but lost the concession contract in 2022. In this side here, China made sure that we're going to get the refurbishment and the concession contract, just to make sure that we don't lose out in that context. This is the second context of the geopolitics now.
We'll get into the geopolitics now. This Tazara Railway is pretty run down, and it's really looking pretty ragged. So it's in need of refurbishment. The rails are old, the cars are old, the engines are old, everything is just old. But there is this move right now between the United States and China to start competing. Before we get into the bigger maps of the logistics competition, why don't you walk us through from Lobito to Dar es Salaam, these railways now. So we've got two major railways to look at. So on the left side of your screen, you've got the Benguela Railway, and that is 1,067 kilometers. The Lobito Corridor, which is this new initiative being put forth by the Europeans and the Americans to refurbish that line. Again, this is all about refurbishment, is to take from the mines in northern Zambia and do I have that correct? Yes, southern DRC and northern Zambia, the copper cobalt belt, and to basically bring that to port. Then you've got an 1,800 kilometer line, I think I have that right, to between Tanzania and Dar es Salaam. Now the Americans,
and Zambia,
okay, that's right. And so the Americans wanted to connect those two to have a link, and that's still in discussion. But what we're hearing is that the Chinese really aren't that excited about linking those two and working collaboratively with the Americans. But if they were, you could see on this graphic here how there is a potential to have Africa's first true transcontinental railway. So that could be very interesting if one day they decide to do that. Hard to imagine right now, though.
Exactly. So this is a very important element of context to understand, because, and I'd like to clarify, because every time when we talk about the Lobito corridor, and the people tend to kind of confuse and to kind of mixed up. The Lobito corridor is a mix of the Benguela Railway and also a part of the DRC Railway in DRC and the parts of the road. It's like the general corridor. So what the US is focusing now is like the Benguela Railway from the Lobito port until the border of the DRC. So what they want to do, there is two innovations. The first of all, they want now to connect a part of Zambia Copper Belt Railway to the Lobito, to the Benguela Railway, to the border with Angola, and to refurbish the DRC part to the Lao, to Angola, to Benguela Railway as well, so to connect all of them. So this is on the part of Lobito Corridor and the Benguela Railway. So on the part of the Tazara, Zambia has not been really, I don't know, China as well has not been really keen in connecting the two of them, because I'd say for obvious reason now, because now since the geopolitics has become the very center point of all this debate now it's becoming how to connect all of them, because it's going to become the question of like management and concession, who's going to control what, is going to be a total mess. So this is where you have all the complexity coming into that debate now.
Now, take a look at this map, and this is one of my favorite maps, and this is a very similar map than you designed out also in our fantastic cobalt map that you produced of mapping the entire cobalt supply chain in the DRC, and you had a logistics map. You're going to have to update that in the next iteration, because things are changing here. Yeah. So everything kind of circles in and centers down in Lubumbashi, Solwezi, Kalwezi, and these are the cobalt and the copper belts. This is where the stuff is coming out. So traditionally right now, everything is going to the port of Durban, where a lot of it's going to the port of Durban. Okay. Now, a lot of the exporters are fed up with the port of Durban. In 2022, there were 22 and 23, at least 3 force majeures that were shut down because of flooding, riots, strikes, all sorts of different issues. They hate that. So they said, we can't be reliant on the port of Durban anymore. So now they're starting to look at Beira, Dar es Salaam, Walvis Bay, and the port of Lobito. Walk us through the logistics here from the point of view of the miners, the exporters, and then also help us understand, why is the United States so keen on this as well?
So traditionally, most of mining companies in the southern part of the DRC and Zambia, they export their product through Durban, Dar es Salaam, Beira ports, as you see that on the Indian Ocean side of the continent. And sometimes some of them they use the Walvis Bay in Namibia. So with the Durban problem, with the Durban ports problem, as you mentioned, with also the very bad condition of Congolese road, You have long lines of truck being jammed in the Congolese road. And you remember last year there was a strike by SADC truckers who who wanted their money to the salary to be increased because they have to take into account the risk of exporting of driving through the Congolese road. So you have that problem. But now you have the Lobito port that offers that options to allow many companies to get access to the ocean and get to the water and move along. I'm gonna give you just an idea. Between Kolwezi and Durban, it takes roughly 40 to 50 days go and back,
Really?
just to go and come back for mining companies to get this truck.
By truck, right? By truck.
By truck, exactly. But it takes roughly around 10 days to leave Kolwezi if you take the Lobito, the Benguela Railway, to get to the Lobito port on the ocean. So the company Kamoa Kakula Ivanhoe Mining, that's signing that in a deal just yesterday with Trafigura to start using the Lobito corridor for its certain part of its export. Yeah,
so just 2 new clients on that.
Exactly. It just tells you that, it's shorter, it's fast, it allows us to get back faster to the ocean. By the time, if we say we're going to China, by the time we leave Lobito, we go down to Durban, the truck that left Kolwezi to Durban would just be going back to take another load from Kolwezi. So yes, this is why the Lobito corridor is quite important for many mining companies. It's a lot of opportunities. So now, for the US companies now, to go back for the US now, the geopolitics is it that it's important because now you have many. US is trying to to fight off or to reduce China's influence in that space. So you have Cobalt, a US mining companies that are now exploring natural resources in Zambia. They want to build cobalt refinery in Zambia as well. So having Lobito is going to allow them to have their own from mine to port logistics and maybe to their own market in the US and to the West. That's why it's important.
Let me just stop there. I just got to understand something. So they want to build a supply chain for critical minerals that go into electric vehicle batteries and other technologies that's free of the Chinese. Okay.
Yeah.
So we have some questions that I'm not sure but maybe you do because you read this more carefully than I do. Number one, is there any reason why the Chinese couldn't also use the Lobito corridor, couldn't go to Trafigura and say, hey, we'd like to be a client because anything that helps us get our cobalt and copper out is good? Now,
objectively, there's none.
I mean, I think the Americans aren't going to be happy with that. They want the Chinese on it.
They're not going to be happy.
What do the Angolans have to say about that?
Exactly. They're not happy, but I'm quite curious to how Trafigura is going to explain to Angola government, we don't want to make more money because we don't want Chinese miners to use the Benguela Railway. It doesn't make sense.
Remember, the Angolans don't have a problem with the Chinese. The Angolans have
they don't.
Chinese, so they're probably going to tell the Americans of whatever spat you're having with the Chinese isn't our fight.
Exactly. Okay. So if any Chinese company wants to be using it, because when they use it, they pay, they make more money. It's like, guys, why are we not going to use that? I'm quite curious to see, I'm really quite curious to see how Trafigura is going to tell, I don't know, CMOC or any Chinese company, no, we cannot sign with you. Why? No, because you're a Chinese company. It doesn't make sense.
So that's open question number one is, will Chinese companies and mining companies be able to use the Lobito corridor if they choose? It's not that efficient for them simply because going to Lobito is on the Atlantic coast. The ships will then have to go around the Cape of Good Hope and then head up back across the Indian Ocean. Still, it could be something that they want to do. Open question number two about the Lobito corridor, and I'm really keen for you and I to go to Washington this summer and to ask people who know the answers to these questions, what's going to happen? Okay. All that cobalt makes it to the port of Lobito. It's American cobalt. It's China-free. Where does it go after that? Because as far as I know, the United States and the Europeans don't process. They don't have those big, massive processing facilities. Whatever processing they're doing in Zambia is at a very early stage of it. It's not the final processing that goes into the Tesla or into the Ford F-150 Lightning and into those batteries, or into the F-35 fighter jet, which the cobalt also is used for. So where does that cobalt go? That's the other question. I don't understand that. No one's been able to explain it to me. They must have a plan, I assume, that says, okay, once it goes from Lobito, is it going to go to China because that's where most of it's processed, or do they have a plan to then process it somewhere else?
If it goes to China, it won't make sense to.
It won't make any sense.
Because, like, guys, why are you focusing that much on Lobito if at the end you leave Dar es Salaam, Beira, and Walvis and Durban, that goes straight to China? It's easier for you to take Lobito in Angola just to come down and to go back to China and to go back to Europe. It doesn't make sense.
I don't think that's the plan. Clearly, that's not the plan.
Exactly.
So I don't know where that's going.
I do believe my suspicion will be that I think they're going to be investing a lot into processing and refineries in DRC, and they're going to have to. They're gonna have. They're really gonna have to, because if they don't, I'm still quite curious. I think they're gonna watch the show. If you're listening to us, guys, can you give us just a hint what the plan are? Because we're really trying to wrap up our mind into that idea. Because
let me show you something here. This is news that just broke today.
Yeah,
$1 billion new nickel processing plant in Canada. So it is possible that they're going to start building processing facilities in the West.
Yeah.
I mean,
it is
possible. So the problem is, though, is that to match the scale of what the Chinese are doing is going to take a lot of time. And
environmental toll is just huge.
Really, what was that?
The toll on the environment is also huge. They're going to have to take that.
So these processing facilities take an enormous amount of power and electricity, and they take a lot of water. So that's just something to think about. Now, Canada has both. So Canada does make sense, but the environmental regulations in Canada, in Europe, in Japan, and elsewhere are quite stringent, that I would find it hard to believe that they're going to pollute their environments to the extent that the Chinese have and the Indonesians are doing now in order to do that. That feels a stretch. But here we go. Canada plans to raise $1 billion. There's a different story, though, Geraud, between planning to raise $1 billion and actually having a plant on the ground.
Exactly.
And one of the things we know is that, in places like Canada, there's a lot of stakeholders involved. Things take time to come to life. So,
exactly. Yeah.
And again, in the last point here, and this is, I think, the funniest one, because just because the Americans want to build and to keep the Chinese out of their cobalt supply chain doesn't mean that Ford or Tesla or the others are going to go along with it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So they're going to follow what their interests are, because remember, these companies are not loyal to the governments. They're loyal to their shareholders. Yeah. And if it's cheaper to buy Chinese cobalt, they're going to do that. Now, the IRA is going to cause some problems for them on that. The Inflation Reduction Act, some of them are going to lose the $7,500 tax credit that comes if you have cobalt or any materials from a foreign-owned entity of concern. I think that's what it is.
Yeah, but
and that makes that disqualifies you for the $7,500 tax credit when you buy an EV, for example.
Exactly, but that's how China is managed now to circumvent by going on joint venture with South Korea and implanting planes in countries like Morocco and all, just to allow them to be able to still get access to that. That's quite interesting. But yeah, those strategies are going to be followed up in the next month or years as well.
Tell me about the Mingomba mine and this company from California that's backed by Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates, and he uses artificial intelligence. It's called Cobalt Metal, I think it is. And tell me a little bit about what happened in Zambia.
So Cobalt Metal is that company that signed a MOU in December 2022, among another MOU we're not going to mention here, but it signed a MOU in 2022 in the US with Zambia government, where they were going to come and invest to do exploration prospects in terms to find new copper deposit in Zambia. So they really put the money where the mouth was, because a few months later they came to Zambia. They invested a lot, $150 million in exploration in Zambia, in the Mingomba mine, in copper mine in Zambia. And they found a deposit, a very hopeful deposit for them.
High
They say,
quality too, right? I
and they
mean, some
say
of the
it's
highest
high
quality
quality.
in the world of copper.
Exactly.
It was copper that they found.
Copper,
Okay.
yes, exactly. So they even say that it might be the copper that the same quality that we find into DRC with the Kamoa Kakula mine in the DRC, where Zin mining is with the Ivanhoe. So they're looking into investing more and to really launching that copper mine. And Mingomba copper mine with cobalt are in that part of the US strategy into trying to develop their own supply chain of critical minerals. Because for those who don't know, copper has been listed among strategic natural resources in Europe. And I know it to a certain extent to the US as well. So now having project like this allow the US now to have its own presence in the mining industry in Zambia, and investing in the Lobito corridor allows them to have, we can have at least now they can guarantee to have straight 100% copper metals from Zambia straight to the US, straight to Europe, and everything. So yeah.
So now you start seeing those pieces come together, where we've got some of the mines, we've got the railways. I mean, again, this seems highly colonial to me, but okay. You just wish there was a different story at the end of the day, that all this money was going in for something else. I don't know. This is a sad story at the end of the day when you think about, all of the centuries of exploitation and tragedy that have happened around mines and ports and extraction in Africa by foreigners.
Exactly. Someone mentioned it. There's like, we're investing so much in railways that take things from in to outside. We don't just invest as much as into integration, regional integration, connection, creating market within Africa, as if, we are just being used in a new way of being just, a huge mine, open pit mine where people can just come and go. Yes, they're saying, yeah, we're gonna build processing, but at the end, if we don't use those processes ourselves, we just like they build the mines here, we process and refine them here, and we export them. It just go out. It doesn't stay here.
Well, let's get to the uncomfortable reality, though. Not for copper, but for other critical minerals. And this is a very difficult reality that's going to confront the Americans, but it's also going to have an impact on the Zambians, the Congolese, and the resource exporting, that these prices for these critical minerals have plunged, and there is no indication that they're going to rebound anytime soon. It looks like there's a lot of supply of lithium, cobalt, and nickel that's coming onto the market. And this mad dash that Chinese, European, Japanese, Korean, American companies have been going all over the world to look for these resources is paying off in the form of an abundance of supply. Now, that's excellent news for those of us who want to buy phones,
electrical cars.
We pay for fighter jets. All of these materials go into so many things. I mean, you think about a lithium-ion battery. It's in this. I mean, it's in the computer. So that will help bring the price down of all those things. So that's good for us as consumers, right? The problem is, though, if you are a producer of it, and that's going to make life very difficult. So your friends in the DRC who are in the mining industry selling cobalt, they're not that happy.
Not really happy, yeah. They're really not happy.
It doesn't look like they're going to be. And you wonder, if you look back at January 22, that's the peak. Did the Congolese or did the Indonesians with the nickel, did they miss the opportunity? Did that window close in 22? And that is the most important thing. Did that window close?
I think the Congolese missed the window of opportunity for cobalt for many reasons, except for lithium and nickel, that I think the price is going to come back up. But for cobalt, I don't think we're gonna reach the 2022 levels anymore. I'd say 2018, 19, and 2022 levels anymore, because when you look at how the industry has been phasing out of cobalt, not beyond the child labor issues. We also have the simple fact that we depend too much on one single country. the industry just phasing out from cobalt slowly. So I think the cobalt price is going to be remaining a bit lower than we used to see before. And yes, the countries like the DRC have missed the opportunities. But the country
Okay.
like Indonesia with nickel and lithium, they might still have a lot of opportunities,
Here,
especially if they move into the processing.
but let me bring your attention to a fantastic interview that our friend and colleague Antonia Timmerman in Jakarta did with an expert there. That the concern in Indonesia, and should be the same concern in the DRC, is the rise of nickel and cobalt free batteries, lithium phosphate batteries. That's LFP
Yes.
batteries.
Yeah.
And so the new BYD factory that's in Indonesia is producing LFP batteries, not lithium ion batteries with nickel and cobalt in them.
Not nickel manganese.
NCM batteries.
Yeah.
So there is a growing concern in many respects that Indonesia may also have missed this boat, because if you get an LFP battery, and by the way, the Chinese are some of the leaders in developing LFP batteries.
Exactly.
Now, LFP batteries don't have the performance of cobalt power batteries. Cobalt is still a resource that is able to generate an enormous amount of power, which is one of the reasons why the higher end Teslas use cobalt batteries. But if the price of these EVs is going to come down, they're going to have to bring the battery price down. And LFPs is a good way to do that. So the Model 3 in China, which is a cheaper, more affordable version of the Model 3 than what you can get in the US, they use an LFP battery. And so Antonia did this fascinating interview, which I invite everybody to go check out on our site, about whether or not the Inflation Reduction Act, again, we come back to the IRA, is also going to cause problems for the Indonesians and lock them out of the US market. So they're coming under two pressures right now. One is the rise of LFP nickel-free batteries, and two is the rise of the rise of the
IRA.
The IRA. That is also a problem for the Congolese as well, because the Chinese presence in the cobalt market there.
Yeah, but the Congolese, they do not send cars or EV product straight to the US. It goes to
No, but if there is Chinese, if again a foreign entity is involved, if a TFM cobalt is in that battery, then it's subject to the sanction, possibly.
Yeah, possibly. But now those cobalts are going through Volkswagen, Tesla, and all those big companies. Basically, they're the ones who are going to have to manage the risk of that. But yes, on the Chinese side, they're still trying to find a way to get into those, to remain present in those markets. And we're going to see really how things are going to evolve in that space. It's quite exciting. It's really quite exciting.
It is quite exciting. I mean, it is, and it's the kind of thing that we cover every day. And you can see how Geraud and I just nerd out on this stuff, and we just absolutely love it. I mean, this is literally like what we're doing right here is what we do every day just in our normal chat. Yeah. So, I mean, this is the unvarnished truth there about doing it. And so we hope that you'll check out everything that we're doing at China Global South. And for those of you who are really interested in this, your subscription helps keep the lights on, helps us be able to do this. We produce agenda-free, independent news and analysis about what China is doing in places like Africa and Indonesia and whatnot. And we can't do it without you. So go to China Global South and you can hit that subscribe button. You'll get 30 days for free. We also do it in French as well, maybe, but that one doesn't have a subscription. That's free for everybody. Geraud, tell everybody about what you're doing at Projet Afrique Chine.
Twice a week, you receive a newsletter summarizing up the stories that we've covered and the story we're going to talk about on the website. We have our Afrique Chine podcast, and we have different content en français, of course, and we have different kind of content that we're also going to produce as well. So yes, we're expanding and we're trying as much as possible to bring the French language into the China Africa space, because for a long time that space has been English dominated space.
Yeah.
When you search for China Africa, 100% of results were just only in English. Even though you are in a French speaking country, the result is going to be the same. Now we are bringing that spot where we bring the debate in French. That's why I'm always calling on Francophone African expert who want to talk about China Africa to come on the show, being on YouTube show or being on
you can email Geraud directly.
Exactly.
We're
Come,
just
we're gonna
dying to get guests. It's not easy,
exactly,
though. It's
exactly. We're
not
gonna
easy.
talk about different topics: security, food, social, anything you want. Come on the show. We are really happy, and we're looking forward to have those conversations with you.
And then also, if people want to follow you on X, you can find
Yes,
Afrique Chine that's
Shane.
there. And
Yeah.
if you want to follow us in English, we're at China GS Project as well. So we're all there. Okay, let's kind of leave our conversation there, Geraud. It was great to be back on the roundtable with you. This is always a lot of fun. Geraud is going to have some folks on next week, again, just of the different editors from the China Global South Project. So for Geraud in Mauritius, I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be back again next week.
Thank you, guys, and see you next week.